Did 300 Spartans fight at Thermopylae?
Yes, but there was also one more! The king! Let's say 301, but it doesn't sound as good.
301, and there were other Greeks there as well, weren't there?
There were other Greeks there too who unfairly get left out of the count a lot as well. Yeah.
Michael, always great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Tristan. I'm slightly nervous about the quick fire round.
Absolutely. So I've got some quick fire Spartan myth-busting questions here that we're dying to know the answers for. First one, the Spartan political system was a monarchic one.
It was, but not a straightforward single king kind of thing. There were two kings. There were also councils of old, experienced men, and there was even a kind of sort of democratic political assembly as well. It was a bit of a mix of all of them.
It's a mix of all three, fair enough. Now, the Spartans were incredibly religious. They really paid respects to omens and all of that.
They did, but I think no more so than any of the other Greeks, kind of the Athenians, the Boeotians, etc. The famous moments when they've sort of refused to go to war have been a bit blown out of proportion. No more religious than anyone else.
Okay, if we go to the Persian Wars, because that's the instant you're talking about, as it goes to the Battle of Marathon and all that, and they say they don't go because of the festival, but it's blown out of proportion. But with the Persian Wars, did the Spartans really throw Persian ambassadors into a well?
No.
Fair enough. Good. Did 300 Spartans fight at Thermopylae?
Yes, but there was also one more! The king! Let's say 301, but it doesn't sound as good.
301, and there were other Greeks there as well,
there were other Greeks there too who unfairly get left out of the count a lot as well. Yeah.
Did 300 Spartans die at Thermopylae?
Again, not quite, but the number doesn't sound good, does it? If it's 299 or 98.
299. Do you know what happened to the other two?
Oh, well, the other two got limped off and they weren't allowed to fight. One sort of chose to run away and he didn't really get a good reception when he kind of got back at all. He sort of got completely excommunicated for having deserted in the field. But the other Greeks who were there, alongside the Spartans, all elected to leave as well. It was just the Spartans who decided to kind of do a vanguard action and hold the pass for a little bit longer to let the others get away.
Well, there you go.
Very noble sacrifice.
Very noble indeed. Did the Spartans always fight against the Persians?
When the Persians were invading, yes, pretty much. Although there were a number who didn't want them to, kind of in the famous invasion of 480 and 479. And equally, of course, famously, when they first invaded 10 years before, the Spartans were a bit late to the scene at the Battle of Marathon and left the Athenians to it. So not always fighting against the Persians. And in fact, if you dial forward to the 4th century BCE, a number of times they'll actually be very happy to take Persian money to help them in their war against Athens, and then to fight both for and against the Persians in the 4th century when it all gets extremely confusing.
I think we've got one of the really big ones next, one of the big myths. The Spartans never retreated or surrendered.
No, not true either. Sorry. There are famous... I think the ideal was, and certainly the myth that they liked to put forward, was that they never retreated or surrendered. But there were occasions when they got forced into it, like during the Peloponnesian War, while fighting against Athens at the Battle of Sphactria, for instance.
Now, this is also another 300 reference, but of course you see the Spartans basically fighting almost naked with the big shield and the spear and the red cloak.
Don't forget the little leather nappy as well that they kind of wear.
How could we forget that?
Well, quite,
a leather nappy. This feels a bit far-fetched as well.
Again, the Spartans were not necessarily fighting in clothes in armour very, very different from many of the other kind of hoplite warriors of other Greek states. Mid-5th century, they've definitely got a helmet, they've got greaves, and they've got a shield. I think the thing that, and obviously they've got their red cloaks, the things that made the Spartans famous. But I think the thing that makes the Spartans potentially stand out is that from quite an early point in time, they get their military kit standardised, so that when they are all there in a line, actually the impression of all the identical armour with the lambdas on their shield for Lacedaemon, for Sparta, kind of really made an impression that would have been very different to the slightly more kind of mix and match approach of some of the other Greek city-states.
And were the Spartans better warriors than other Greeks?
They certainly liked to think so, and they certainly tried to tell everyone that they were so. And in many ways, the elite Spartan male who went through the kind of system of training that produced the elite Spartan warrior, probably was at the end of the day, pretty damn good and superior to many. But the Spartans as a whole were not necessarily superior to all the other Greek warriors because they lost just as number of battles against other Greeks as they won them.
Well, that kind of leads on to the next question. If we now focus on Spartan life and society, I mean, was the Spartan institution heavily geared towards war?
Yes, for those elite Spartan kind of males. So at the age of 7, if you were a Spartan kind of elite Spartan male, at the age of 7 you got put into a system called the agoge, which is just means training, and that would last through until you were 30. So 23 years of training to become a warrior, effectively. And when you came out the other side of it, you were a trained warrior. So in terms of Spartan society dedicating a huge amount of time and space and effort to constructing a kind of long-term training school for this small band of elite warriors, then yes, Spartan society was very, very militaristic.
And were these figures, were they also encouraged to steal from others?
At a certain point, so different ages in that 7 to 30 would have different kind of focuses on the different ages of their training. But in that first phase, so the 7 through to 12, one of the key things they were supposed to learn was to be able to survive on their wits, and to survive and at the cost of others. And thus stealing was actually encouraged. And they had to be able to do it to survive. They were sort of turfed out and made to fend for themselves. And stealing was never, as a result, punished, but being caught for stealing was punished, because you had failed at the test of being able to actually get away with it.
Now, if we talk about food, Spartan food, notoriously bad?
Again, I think the part of Spartans suffer here a little bit. I mean, so as part of the agoge, the men would kind of live within these sort of dining messes, and those messes would continue after they'd finished their agoge training, so for the rest of their lives. And these dining messes are called sycition, and people would be supposed to bring ingredients to the sycition to make kind of a communal food table. And so I don't think we should think about the food that was available there as any better or any worse than kind of anywhere else in the Greek world. But the Spartans do get a rep for a particular thing that they made, which is called melatzomas, black broth, which is basically, I had this stuff made for me and tasted it once upon a time, and it's pig's blood, pig meat and sort of barley, basically all kind of boiled together, and it does taste pretty rank. And there's a famous quote by a king, a kind of ruler coming from southern Italy, where everyone was a lot more luxurious and a lot more refined in their taste. But what he famously says is that once he tried the black broth, he realised why Spartans were so willing to die on the battlefield. So it's probably to avoid having to eat this stuff ever again.
Fair enough. Now the next one, the Spartans didn't have slaves.
No, they absolutely did, but they had a special name for their slaves, which was called helots. And the Spartans were unusual in that normally Greek city-states grab their slaves from really far afield, so you kind of bring them from another part of the wider Mediterranean world. Spartans actually enslaved the direct area around where they lived in Sparta and the Peloponnese, and turned the entire resident population into their helot slave community, their slave group. And there was probably like one Spartan warrior for 7 helots, so it's quite a good ratio. But what that meant was the Spartans were actually peculiarly worried throughout their history about slave rebellions, because obviously all of their slaves had a single identity. They were all one group, and that made it much more likely that they were going to come together and go, we are going to throw off the shackles of enslavement. And there were a number of slave rebellions in kind of helot Spartan history. And the Spartans often were a bit less keen to engage in foreign wars where they had to travel off elsewhere just in case the Spartan helot community back home chose the moment to rebel against them.
Well, there you go. Now, this definitely seems, of all these infamous myths, perhaps the most infamous. But it is one that we sometimes do associate with Sparta. Now, what's the truth behind, did Spartans throw babies off Mount Taygetos?
Somebody definitely said they did. So an ancient writer called Plutarch kind of mentions this, but we think it was a bit of a myth. Plutarch's writing quite late on and talking back about this Spartan Mirage, it gets talked about, the kind of the image that Sparta very, very much wanted actively to portray to the outside world, because it's a brilliant defense. If you've got a myth about yourself that you are, elite warriors, undefeatable in battle, you never surrender, only the strongest survive in your community, very few people are going to be bothered to attack you. So actually, it's a brilliant defense mechanism. But we know, and we definitely think that children, babies, were examined in some form at birth, and if they were decided to be too weak, they would probably just be left in the woods or the mountains to die by exposure. I don't think necessarily there was a ceremonial walking to the top of a particular mountain and a chucking off.
It's horrible nonetheless. Now, Spartan women had more freedom than other Greek women.
Yes, I would say this is absolutely true. So Spartan women were supposed to do their bit, which inevitably meant being fit and healthy in order to produce good Spartan warriors of the next generation. And actually, for the Spartans, what that meant was that they needed both physical training, a lot more than kind of women from other Greek communities got, but also a certain amount of intellectual training as well, because when the Spartan men were off fighting, actually the women stepped up to run a lot of the kind of civil service, governmental kind of positions within Spartan society and kept everything going in the meantime. So Spartan women had their own kind of a go-getter process that they went through, where they got a certain amount of learning, certainly more than Greek women did in other Greek city-states, and then also physical training. And crucially, interestingly enough, they were also able to inherit property, which was totally alien to every other Greek city-state.
The Spartans were renowned for their pithy responses.
Yes.
Brilliant.
So that's where we get the phrase laconic. So the laconic comes from Lacedaemonian Spartan, kind of meaning short, pithy response to stuff. And again, it's all part of this image that the Spartans like to create of themselves. Men of few words, but a big action.
Well, I think that kind of also, we've been hinting at perhaps the answer to this last myth, that the Spartan myth is largely thanks to non-Spartan writers.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So Spartans didn't go in for writing a lot about themselves, they're not, but there is a bit of Spartan poetry surviving. I mean, if, just a bit turgid, to be honest, and a bit kind of like heavy on the war theme. But most of what we hear about Sparta comes, as you say, from writers from outside Sparta looking in. Occasionally, it's a sort of midway point. So Xenophon, the writer Xenophon, who starts life as an Athenian, but actually he sort of ends up migrating to kind of become a Spartan and live as a Spartan. He writes quite a lot about them as well. But most of what we hear is from the outside. And so it's this extraordinarily clever trick that the Spartans in some ways pulled off, that they got everyone else to tell a story about them that actually benefited them more than anyone else.
That's interesting, isn't it? Michael, this has been great. Thanks so much for doing this short thing for History Hit.
Thanks very much.
Check out the History Hit YouTube, where you can get great exclusive videos and a sneak peek at what's available on the world's best history channel, History Hit TV. It's growing really fast. We're thrilled to have you all aboard.